Scenes of devastation continue to emerge from Kathmandu after a 7.8 magnitude earthquake leveled much of Nepal last weekend, killing and injuring thousands and affecting over 8 million people in the surrounding areas. Even the subsequent aftershocks have been nearly as powerful from this rare geological event. John Bellini, a geophysicist at the United States Geological Survey's National Earthquake Information Center, said, quote, "The basics of the geology of the region are you have the Indian tectonic plate being thrust and pushed underneath the Eurasian continental plate. And because these two plates are moving toward each other, this force builds up over time. It's something that's not constantly moving, but when it does move, it creates a jolt, and you have a large earthquake." End quote. While this area doesn't have an extensive history of earthquakes, they were the forces responsible for forming the Himalayas. International search, rescue, and recovery teams have been arriving this week, but they also face challenges, as some villages are so remote and prone to mudslides that getting there poses significant challenges, let alone the humanitarian issues that all face. In addition to the loss of life, some say that roughly 20% of Kathmandu's buildings have been destroyed. Among them are some UNESCO World Heritage Sites that will never get back. As one might expect, massive fundraising efforts are underway to help those in need. A link can be found in the show notes for this episode of Asian News Weekly if you would like to contribute. Apple has also created a Red Cross donate page within the iTunes Store for ease. For updates on the search, rescue, and recovery, be sure to follow the hashtags Pray for Nepal and Nepal Quake. And now, Asian News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. Everyone else wants to follow the rule of law in the South China Sea, but does China? Has Abe's forward-looking statements wooed the world and left South Korea out in the cold? And just what is the political climate in South Korea? These stories and more are coming up on the May 1st edition of Asia News Weekly. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a fantastic week, and if you're getting May Day off, congratulations. I, of course, am not. My name is Steve Miller, your host, and it's my pleasure to spend a little bit of time with you, so thank you so much for joining me. So let's go ahead and get started with our very first story. The topic that comes up more frequently than anything else here on this podcast, as well as Asia Now, is that of the tension in the South China Sea, and, well, quite frankly, this week is no exception. Last week, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel shooed away a Filipino fishing boat from waters it had traditionally used to catch fish in. Then, not only the United States, but those attending the recent ASEAN meeting said that restraint should be used in the region and adherence to the rule of law. Saying one supports the rule of law and should restrain one's action is great, but China is playing by its own rules. So, how long can ASEAN members keep on that specific path? That's the question I put to Scott Harold, political scientist and deputy director for the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation.
Well, I think it's important, Steve, to disaggregate ASEAN members. Some ASEAN members are not even on the path of calling for anyone to observe the rule of law because they're essentially avoiding the issue. I think it's probably the case that apart from the most formalistic statements, countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar are not really very involved or interested in this issue, and so are not likely to, at any point, no matter really what happens, to dramatically increase their investment in a policy that is essentially one that is in the service of kind of a greater international law principle as well as the material interests of the specific claimant countries, and by that I'm referring most specifically to Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, and Malaysia, but also at a broader level to the rest of maritime Southeast Asia, i.e. Singapore and Indonesia. The countries that do have a material interest or at least feel greater exposure, i.e. those countries that I just named as maritime countries, they are increasingly moving to do more than just encourage China to sign a binding code of conduct and to comport its behavior and claims with international law and legal norms. They are doing things in the realm of increasing their own capabilities, witness Vietnam's purchase of several kilo submarines from Russia, witness the efforts by the Philippines to upgrade its defense cooperation with the United States, as well as to procure new capabilities for its own military. And they're also doing a lot of new things in the areas of exercising and engaging in kind of constant presence, i.e., having ships and planes traverse the areas in and around their own claims, as well as carrying out multilateral exercises with countries like the U.S., Australia, and potentially at some point in the future, one could imagine Japan or Taiwan, both of which have expressed at least some interest in carrying out their own activities in the South China Sea, either in the furtherance of their claims in the case of Taiwan or in support of international legal norms and the kind of attempt to prevent changes through coercion, changes to the status quo through coercion in the case of Japan. So I would say that the countries involved most directly are trying to support their vision of the region with more than just kind of hortatory calls on China to change its behavior.
Now, you also brought up the whole notion of the code of conduct. Now, one of the problems, of course, with those that have a stake in this is that China always wants to have bilateral discussions with the claimant countries. What do you think it would take to get China to sit down on a multilateral table to discuss and finally hash everything out so that everyone can ratify that 2002 agreement and we get to a point where things are more or less normalized and people do follow that rule of law?
That's an excellent question. The code of conduct, I think I would separate from a solution to the actual claims. So first, China's position is that it wants to sit down and negotiate bilaterally over the actual status of specific maritime features, to include the 9-dash line and what falls within it. I think the code of conduct is a separate issue, although it's clearly very intimately related. The code of conduct is an effort to try to regulate behavior and agree on certain kinds of practices that would govern, or norms that would govern behavior in the South China Sea in an area where these disputes exist. Quite clearly, you're right. I think it's not possible to imagine that China could bilaterally resolve all of these claimed disputes just by talking one-on-one with these countries, since if China agreed to something with the Philippines, but the Vietnamese were also a claimant state there, the Vietnamese would quite likely not accept that, and then it would fall to China to, I suppose, negotiate Vietnamese cooperation or a Vietnamese accession to China's negotiation with the Philippines, which just seems very difficult to imagine. What really the easier pathway to a negotiated settlement would be for all the claimant countries to sit down and agree to some sort of a mechanism by which they would reach an agreement on how to resolve this. And of course, the one that most people point to is an international arbitral tribunal that could help the countries by pointing to previous instances of how maritime territorial disputes or maritime disputes have been negotiated. Unfortunately, there does appear to exist, at least in most Chinese or in some Chinese minds, an alternative pathway to the resolution of these disputes, and that is one that's premised primarily on the use of overwhelming material capabilities, perhaps not the use of force, but at least the use of coercion through a strategy of simply swamping all of the other claimants with China's ability to put kind of paramilitary fishermen, maritime law enforcement vessels, and ultimately the power of the PLA Navy against these smaller claimant states and essentially twist their arms until they agree to give up. Now, it is worth noting China has not used military force against any other country to date and has not taken any of the claimed features. But the acme of skill in Chinese traditional strategic thought is to win without fighting. And if they're able to create what essentially amounts to an extremely integrated power projection capability for air naval operations in the far reaches of the South China Sea, and use that to essentially present the other claimant states with a fait accompli. Those countries are not going to be capable of standing toe-to-toe with China and fighting it. So then you ask, what could possibly be done? Well, I suppose if China were to face an enormous outcry by its neighbors, where it was really dramatically affecting their overall relationship. In other words, if the countries simply decided, well, we can't engage economically with China if they're going to do this, and if they were to turn against China in all international forums, then conceivably the cost to China of making these kinds of claims would go too high. But thus far, China has not really been presented with very substantial costs. I mean, they've been presented with some loss of reputation, some moral condemnation, if you will, but I think most Chinese analysts view those condemnations as par for the course, since these are seen as self-interested condemnations by their claimant states, and they don't carry much in the way of material penalties.
Scott Harold, political scientist and deputy director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. Thanks so much for your time.
Absolutely, Steve.
What do you think? Will China sit down with everybody, or will they continue to flex their muscles? Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or via Twitter. Now, coming up a little bit later, political tensions continue to grow in Seoul, and we'll get the latest in just a little bit. The history of East Asia is incredibly interwoven, dating back to the First Sino-Japanese War, which was fought primarily over the Korean Peninsula. Tensions continue and have remained high between Japan, South Korea, and China. Now that we've reached the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been facing a lot of scrutiny over how he will mark that particular occasion. Last week on the Asia Now podcast, I was joined by Jonathan Miller, fellow on East Asia from the East-West Institute, where he discussed the lingering issues between South Korea and Japan. Now, today he joins me once more to take a look at the Prime Minister's recent trip to the United States, and more importantly, his address to the joint session of the U.S. Congress, as well as his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. So, Jonathan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Steve. Glad to be here.
So, just recently, Abe completed his address to the joint session of the United States Congress, and I want to ask you, what did he say? And I guess more importantly, who's going to be happy and who isn't going to be happy with his words?
Well, I think, from a macro perspective, Steve, this was a very successful speech by Abe. I feel like Abe was able to address some of the main points that he wanted to deliver, which were, number one, he wanted to talk about the closeness of the United States-Japan alliance going forward. I think, number two, he wanted to explain the recently revised bilateral defense guidelines. Number three, I think he wanted to stress the importance of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trading Pact, which the United States and Japan are, the largest economies leading that. And I think number four, on the historical perspective, I think that he wanted to demonstrate that Japan and the Abe administration is looking for a forward-leaning view. And I think from an American perspective, he did very well, showing his expressing his deepest condolences to the United States soldiers that were lost in World War II. So from an American perspective, he did quite well. I'm sure there's going to be criticisms from East Asian countries, specifically China and South Korea, that he didn't go far enough. But from my perspective and from the perspective of probably a lot of U.S. Japan watchers, is that what he said with regard to World War II was sufficient, and he also mentioned and reaffirmed that he would uphold previous statements such as the Kono and the Murayama statement. And he mentioned deep remorse for some of the crimes that were committed during World War II against China and Korea. Obviously, that's not going to be enough. There wasn't a direct apology, so I think there's going to be some backlash to that. But I think it was generally quite well received by most in the United States.
Well, let's follow up on that. I mean, it wasn't just China and South Korea asking for a full apology. I mean, you had the novelist in Japan, even the crown prince in Japan saying that we need to apologize. We need to take this quote unquote correct view of history. Given Abe's language, is that something that we'll see in the future, or was his words essentially good enough for his core constituency back home that that's the base he's going to play to?
Well, I think Abe has, crafted this speech and will be crafting his remarks later this summer very carefully. And I think that, he's taking many things into account here. Some of it is his core constituency back home and making sure that he doesn't go too far on one side, on perhaps with an outright apology, as we mentioned. I think another thing that he's taken into account, and you can see it in his tone, is the position of the U.S. on this. I think when it was 2013, when he visited the Yasukuni Shrine, there was quite a backlash from the United States on that. And when there started to be some talk about maybe not revising the Kono statement, but there was talk about reviews of the details in the Kono statement. That wasn't well received in the United States too. So this speech to me shows that Abe is at least receiving the message that there's a little bit of pushback, not only from China and South Korea, but also from its ally in the United States. Where this will go forward, I don't exactly know, but I feel that this positions future Japanese leaders to go potentially continue back on the previous course of before Abe and the statements that are quite sufficient, such as Kono and Murayama.
Okay, now one last question before I let you go. Prior to his visit to the United States, he did have the opportunity to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and that meeting lasted 30 minutes, went a whole lot better than that awkward handshake we saw last year. He still hasn't met with President Park Geun-hye, who still refuses to meet with him based on Abe's view of history. Is Abe making these diplomatic rounds, meeting with world leaders, essentially leaving South Korea and President Park out in the cold?
Yeah, I think, it's great that you mentioned the meeting between Xi and Abe, the second one. And it did seem, just from the atmospherics, that it was a much better meeting. I think that Abe, you're right. His diplomatic outreach since he's began has been incredible. It's unprecedented for a Japanese prime minister to have traveled as much as he has, to have visited as many countries. And a huge reason for that is the strained relations with Korea and China, just freeing up that diplomatic calendar and that availability to do that. I don't know so much that the intent there is from the Japanese side is to leave out South Korea. I believe that there seems to be, at least at the highest bureaucratic levels, a push to conclude a summit with Park. But I feel like right now it seems like the sticking points which we discussed last time, there can't be an agreed upon precondition for that meeting. And I think that's the thing that Abe seems to be abrasive of, is this idea of preconditions to summits. And it was the same problem with the Chinese meeting until that happened last November, was that Abe did not want to be forced into preconditions for a summit. And I feel like that seems to be the current status with the Japan-Korea summit, is that South Korea feels that there are certain things that it needs to achieve before domestically it can accept, a bilateral summit. And,
and you're absolutely right. Even in the editorials in the paper, that's the message that is repeated over and over again. Until Japan addresses history correctly, there's no point in meeting with Abe.
Yeah. So I get that from the South Korean perspective. So I think that the frustration that I've been hearing from the Japanese perspective on this is defining what that means, and I think that is this is kind of a bit of the nebulous territory is where what does that mean facing history squarely, and then a lot of the response from the South Korean side, well you should know what that means. I think that, as I said before, it seems like it's going to have a very constructive one. It could be tricky right now under the two leaders due to the historical baggage that they both have.
Very true. All right, Jonathan Miller, fellow on East Asia with the East-West Institute. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
What are your thoughts on the issue? Does Prime Minister Shinzo Abe need to formally apologize, or does simply acknowledging the past and drafting statements looking forward to a brighter future suffice? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Now, coming up in just a few minutes, the Weekly Brief, a summary of major stories that you may have missed. Joining me on the phone is Tae-hoon. He is the publisher and managing editor of the Korea Observer. Tae-hoon, how you doing?
Good. Thank you, Steve.
All right, so President Park Geun-hye has just returned from her South American tour, and previously she was undergoing a lot of criticism, a lot of domestic political strife. How are things today for the president?
I would say her 12-day four-nation trip was very successful from a point of view. Park Geun-hye left the country on the first anniversary of the Seoul ferry disaster, and the public's distrust and disappointment against her were at the peak. When a head of state is abroad, and the media tend to focus on a lot of positive things. For instance, the media were busy talking about Korea's defense industry tapping into the Peru market, Korea's K-pop and medical industry entering the Latin American countries. Tens of thousands of people actually took to the street to protest near the Blue House against Park Geun-hye while she was abroad. But, it wasn't nearly effective because she was abroad. At the moment, many Koreans are very scared of the possible financial crisis. And as they are predominantly focused on jobs, security, and the economy, she has a little less to worry about all those political turmoil and the protesters, which many conservatives actually think are hurting the economy.
Well, and just recently this week, there was a by-election for parliament, and even though there was that huge bribery scandal and forthcoming investigation into it, the Saenuri Party won hands down.
Wow. Yes, that happened. Interestingly, after the 12-day trip, a lot of Koreans forgot about the corruption, and also the public attention diverted from her aide, Park Geun-hye, and the ruling party to the opposition party. In fact, a recent poll shows 82% of the people now believe Song Wan-jong, the late businessman who killed himself after leaving a note saying several of Park Geun-hye's aides were involved in taking bribes from him. Anyway, the 82% of the poll believe the late Song Wan-jong would have also given bribes to the opposition party. This is mainly because Park pointed out that there should be a fair and thorough investigation against the opposition party, who actually pardoned twice of Song.
Now, bottom line here, there was some speculation before she left on whether or not Park Geun-hye would be considered a lame duck, whether or not she'd be able to push any of her agenda left through the parliament during her last 2 years in office. Do you think that she's now could be classified as a lame duck president?
No, I don't think so. As you can see from the by-election, the opposition party was very divided, and they were unwilling to come together and fight against the Conservative Party, even though there were clear evidences and support towards them. So I don't think there will be a lame duck presidency anytime soon. And it's obvious that prosecutors are on the government side as well. Justice minister is appointed by the president, and prosecutors who are under the Justice Ministry have limitations in investigating the corruption and doubt of the current government. So, the
a lot of things are in favor of her side. And there are still many people who believe that Park Geun-hye is not directly involved in corruption. In fact, many conservative people view her as the only hope to root out the corruption. I don't think she will be directly affected unless an investigation or someone reveals that she was directly involved in taking bribes or corruption, which should be very, I suspect, unlikely.
All right, Tae-hoon is the publisher and managing editor of the Korea Observer. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Steve.
All right, my friends, coming up tomorrow on the Asian Now podcast, destinations and tips for getting the most out of your Asian summer vacation. It's time now for the Weekly Brief, and this week I'll be taking an expanded view at some of the major stories that took place in the region, so let's go ahead and get started. Tuesday, Indonesia executed several convicted drug felons, among them Murian Sakuraman and Andrew Chan, also known as the ringleaders for the Bali Nine. This was despite last-ditch efforts by Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. She claimed the trial judges had asked for tens of thousands of dollars to sentence the two to less than 20 years in prison, saying, quote, "These allegations are very serious. They call into question the integrity of the sentencing process, and it's a matter for Indonesia's Judicial Commission to investigate these matters, and that underlines why we continue to request Indonesia to allow the Judicial Commission to finalize its review. This must be allowed to continue before any action is taken to prepare for executions. An execution is an irrevocable step, and I believe that these hearing and these appeal processes should be concluded before any decision is taken." End quote. The Indonesian lawyer is also requesting an independent legal investigation. The execution of a ninth individual, a Filipino, was postponed at the 11th hour. An alleged perpetrator of human trafficking gave herself up, and Mary Jane's testimony is needed, said Tony Spantana, a spokesman for the Indonesian Attorney General, who wrote in a text message shortly after the executions were carried out. Quote, 8 people were executed, but not Mary Jane. End quote. Calling the executions cruel and unnecessary, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott recalled his country's ambassador on Wednesday. But based on Australia's long-standing ties with Jakarta, it's doubtful this recall will last for long. Human Rights Watch opposes the death penalty in all circumstances because its inherent cruelty. Indonesia's use of the death penalty is inconsistent with international human rights laws, statements of UN human rights experts, and various UN bodies. Human rights laws uphold every human being's inherent right to life and limits the death penalty to the most serious crimes, typically crimes resulting in death or serious bodily harm. Yu Shi-wen, a former student leader of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, has been indicted in China. One piece of information that's being used against Yu is an interview with the Voice of America. Court documents accuse Yu of causing public disorder by giving an interview to the VOA about a private June 4 memorial he held with friends last year. Yu's lawyer says the claims are baseless. Quote, posting information on the internet, including videos and accepting interviews, are also legal. Because you made this information public, making it known to people, in other words, clicking on relevant websites, constitutes a crime, I think this is simply something you can't say has a legal basis. It completely violates human reason. It has no common sense. End quote. Yu was one of more than 10 human rights activists detained last year and remains the only one still incarcerated. I mentioned in last week's Asian News Weekly podcast that the Thai draft constitution would enter a new phase this week, following a debate lasting through the previous weekend. Before the end of May, political parties have the opportunity to send in suggestions. However, the junta is preventing their groups from meeting during this time to debate the charter further, saying they had ample opportunity to do it before and are still posting their thoughts through various social networking sites. Since assuming control of the nation, the junta has strictly regulated the activities of political parties, and this is no exception. The National Council for Peace and Order's rationale is that political meetings wouldn't achieve anything and only serve to further push the opinions of senior members and not the constituency. A report released this week in South Korea shows once more that the leading cause of death among teens and young people is suicide. 10 years ago, traffic accidents were the primary cause of death, but sadly, these two have changed places. According to Statistics Korea, the suicide rate for 9 to 24-year-olds per 100,000 stood at 7.8, up from 7.4 in 2003. South Korea's suicide rate peaked in 1998 and then dipped slightly. In more recent years, it's been growing once again. A Filipino Marine who is connected to 2 previous attempts to oust former President Gloria Arroyo announced he was going to venture into the contested South China Sea as part of a patriotic protest against China. Nicanor Faildun, who decried the alleged corruption under the Arroyo government, will start the voyage on April 30th from Batanes, the Philippines' northernmost island province. From there, he is scheduled to arrive in October near the western island of Palawan, near the disputed Spratly Islands. He's calling for all Filipinos to support the government's activities protecting the nation's interests and sovereignty. He hopes that at least 1 vessel from each province will join him on his journey, so if all goes well, he'll be leading a fleet of some 80 vessels. And that is just a quick look at some other top stories from the region. Coming up on Sunday's Patreon exclusive podcast, additional news and commentary from the region. Well, my friends, the podcast is winding down, but before I go, let's take a quick look at some of your comments from this past week. Now, first up, Dimitri Perrin wrote, "As much as I like your work, this week's focus on cryogenics is a little disappointing. There is enough good science happening every week in Asia to pick from, and there are big topics. For instance, this week's gene editing in human embryos." And Dimitri, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of great science taking place within the region, and I appreciate you calling me out and giving me some feedback on some of the stories that you like and some of the stories that you don't. And I hope everyone does take time to leave comments, shoot me a message, and let me know what you like to hear and what you don't. As much as I go through the news and pick stories that I find interesting, there may be some other stories that I miss, and it would be better served if you would let me know what kind of stories you would like to see featured on the various podcasts that I produce. Now, also, a message came in from Ken Bout-Hillier. "I listen to the Asia Now podcast regularly in Florida after finding it this past year on iTunes. The recent episode about Sean Ahmed was hugely inspiring and educational. Keep up the great work on the podcast. It continues to get better and better with every episode." Thank you. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to send me that message. Again, feedback is always great. I love hearing from each and every one of you, so thank you so much for taking the time to send me your thoughts. Now, as of course you might expect, last week's podcast about Korean and Japanese issues spurred a lot of comments. And I really want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate in those discussions. But on occasion, people were resorting to some, let's say, racially charged words, and I don't support that. I don't agree with that. And really, please remember, when you resort to using language like that, it doesn't make your point any more valid. In fact, in many ways, it detracts from your message. So please, if you have a point, stick to it and get rid of the name calling. Now, this week, of course, there was no Asia Brief podcast, only the Asia News Weekly podcast, tomorrow's Asia Now podcast. And I want to bring up a point. This is the portion of the year that a lot of individuals in South Korea, including myself, start job searching for the next academic appointment, whether it be here in South Korea or if you're looking for the traditional August start at universities abroad. And like I said, I am part of that job applicant pool. So over the next possibly 2 months, there may be instances where I may miss a podcast of the Asia Brief, Asia News Weekly, or Asia Now, and I do apologize for that in advance. Know that as much as I would like to keep this up on a steady and regular basis, I do have other commitments out there, so that is what I'll be doing. So until then, thank you so much for listening today. If you have a thought, if you have a comment, please leave it in the comment section. Shoot me a message via email, write it on Facebook, or send it in via Twitter. You can, of course, keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And like I said, shoot me a message. The email address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed this week's program, please share it with your friends. And if you haven't, subscribe. It's absolutely free and easy to do. And when you do so, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can do it on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application, like iTunes or Stitcher. Well, my friends, that's all the time this week. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, my name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.